Welcome to our fourth year of our speaker series, and this year's topic is going to be historic preservation. And I think it's a good topic for historical societies to tackle. It's something I think there's a ton of information out there, and I think at the end of this month, you're going to walk away having learned a lot of really good things about historic preservation and why it matters to communities. We are starting off this week and this month with Jim Draeger. He's the architectural historian in the Historic Preservation and Public History Division at the Wisconsin State Historical Society in Madison. I've had the privilege with working with him a few times. It's fun. And he writes some fantastic books. I use one as a tour guide book, Bottoms Up, the tavern book. So I keep that in the trunk of the car when I'm out traveling. You know, you never know, so you have to see them. So I think I'll just turn it over to Jim right away, and we'll get going with it.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Are we okay on the mic? Yeah. All right, great. Well, great to see you all here. You know, it's great living in Wisconsin. You can have a snowstorm, people still come out. Yeah, big deal. Yeah.
And you're all old.
It's just a dusting. It's only a foot of snow. It's not something we're going to stop doing what we normally do because of it. That's great. So what I'm going to do tonight is what I'm going to focus on is I'm going to focus on the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm the State Historic Preservation Officer of Wisconsin. So I'm going to focus on preservation kind of from the perspective of what we do. And I'm going to talk specifically about Sheboygan and talk about, what the relationship that we've had with Sheboygan to date in historic preservation. And I'm going to, in some ways I'm going to pick on Sheboygan a little bit because I think there's so much more potential for historic preservation in Sheboygan. And one of the ways I'm going to talk about that is I'm going to talk about it in relationship to La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is similar population to Sheboygan, and I'm going to kind of show the impact that La Crosse has, not to make people feel bad, but to show them what potential is there and how Sheboygan could be doing so much more and having an even bigger impact on the community by using historic preservation as a tool. Oops, that did nothing, didn't it? Let's see. Okay, there we go. I'll start with a little bit about the Wisconsin Historical Society because I don't know how much you know about us. Historical Society was founded in 1846, and for those of you who are up on your Wisconsin history, Wisconsin became a state in 1848. So the Historical Society's 2 years older than the state of Wisconsin. And I'd like to say that that's really foresight, that people thought, if we're going to establish a state, let's establish some place that collects the history of the state. It's really not true. There was a failed constitutional convention in 1846 because the Constitution was voted down because it had this very, very radical notion that the men who were there to vote on it just couldn't abide, and that was that women could own property. So they defeated it, and they got that nasty little bit out of there, and then the men were all in agreement at that point, 2 years later. So we've been around for a very long time. We have some really, really significant collections, and this is just kind of some of the highlights of the things that we have. We have over 5 million photographs. We have the 5th largest film collection in the United States. We own the Universal Studios film collection, among other things, and we're one of the renowned collections of film We also have scripts for movies and things like that. We have all of the scripts for the Twilight Zone episodes with Rod Serling's notations in the margins. Some really significant stuff. We're the largest North American history library in the United States outside of the Library of Congress itself. We have 28 linear miles of books and manuscripts. We're currently moving into a new state-of-the-art offsite storage building, and we're moving 40,000 cubic feet of materials into this new storage area because, as the former director of the Society, Ellsworth Brown, always said, history is a growth business. We make more every day. So if you're an institution that collects history, and Travis can probably echo this, if you're going to collect history, you have to keep collecting it, or you leave a hole in your understanding of the past, and that means that you run out of space, and you have to have more space, and that's just part of what you sign on to. We have some really nationally important collections in our Historical Society archives, like Daniel Boone's papers. We have the only manuscript written or only journal kept during the Lewis and Clark expedition. We have all the costume designs of Edith Head, for those of you ladies who love movies from the 30s and 40s. Edith Head, she was the most famous costume designer in cinematic history, designed all of the costumes for Gone with the Wind, for example. A lot of really famous films. Rod Serling, I've mentioned. Freedom Summer was the effort to register black voters in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and we sent archivists down there to collect the papers of the groups that were doing that organizing. So we have one of the best civil rights collections in the United States. So we have a lot of really neat stuff. Come and visit us. Okay, here's my pitch for historic preservation. People like historic buildings. They do. They really like them. You know, for a lot of people, it's all about community identity and local history. They like historic places because they tell the stories of where people live and what they do, and it gives you a sense of identity. It roots you in the past. It makes you feel part of your community. It's one of the touchstones that we use to connect to the place that we live. Sheboygan County Courthouse, one of my favorite buildings in Sheboygan. Spectacular, spectacular interior. It's just really amazingly great. So when I come here, I pay homage to it. And a lot of people enjoy historic preservation because of heritage tourism. You know, people travel. The number one reason why people travel in Wisconsin is because of history, believe it or not. And if you think of, you know, the 14,000 lakes in Wisconsin, all the recreational outdoor activities in the state, historic tourism is bigger than that. So that is number one reason why people travel to the state. They come to see interesting places that are different than the place that they live in and have an experience of that. So a lot of communities have built a part of their economy around heritage tourism. You know, historic local pride in where you live is another big part of it. Here's the thing about historic buildings, though. They do not preserve themselves. Historic buildings are inanimate objects, and they don't care if they're in good condition or they're in poor condition. They don't care if they're demolished or they are treated well. They don't care. It takes people to do that caring. And that's why historic preservation is important, because if we as people don't take an action to preserve the things that are meaningful to us, we can't expect that somebody else is going to do that for us. And buildings are, important buildings that could be preserved and should be preserved are lost every day as a result. So I'm going to go back a little bit in time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, because it was really an important piece of legislation. It was the watershed moment for historic preservation in America, where the federal government said there is a public interest in preserving things that are important to the past, and the federal government should play a leadership role in that. This building here, in this slide, there are these two black and white pictures. That's the Plankington Mansion in Milwaukee. And a lot of times historic preservation on a local level is spurred by some kind of action where some really important historic building was lost. And in Milwaukee's case, it was this building here. It was owned by Marquette University, and they tore it down in the middle of the night. They planned to tear it down. People in the city agitated against it, and they came in at night with a bulldozer, and they did this to the front of the building so that the building would be structurally unsound and they could just take it down. And the city couldn't do anything about it because there was no local preservation ordinance that protected that building, so one of the most important buildings in the history of the city of Milwaukee was lost. Historic preservation as a national movement grew out of some significant pieces of legislation. It had a really dramatic effect on historic properties. One of them was the Housing Act of 1949. And the Housing Act, we know it best as urban renewal. The theory behind it was America's inner cities were full of buildings that were blighted, that the federal government could provide funding to clear out those blighted properties and make room for redevelopment. And these are pictures of Milwaukee. All of these buildings in Milwaukee were demolished. Entire neighborhoods were taken down using federal money, your and my taxpayer dollars. And when preservationists look back at this, we call this program urban removal, because that's what it was really successful at. It demolished thousands and thousands of buildings for redevelopment that never happened. So they just literally cleared out entire sections of cities of historic properties. Another really significant program was the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956. And the purpose of this legislation was to create the interstate highway system. It grew out of, it was spurred in part by President Dwight Eisenhower's experiences during World War II as they were fighting the war in Europe, and they were having to move all of that military equipment around through these very narrow European streets and all of that. And so as the Cold War started heating up between Russia and America, the military leaders said, we have to have the ability to rapidly transport military equipment from one part of the country to the other. And that was part of the impetus for the interstate program. That's why it's called the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act. So it was meant for, in part, to be able to move military equipment quickly. But it also created these large corridors that ran through the United States and connected cities together with limited access highways and a modern transportation infrastructure. But the thing about it was that when the Interstate Highway Program was created, they gave no regard whatsoever for historic properties. An engineer would draw a line on a map and say, okay, the highway needs to go here. Didn't matter what was in the way. All of that stuff was just condemned and demolished and cleared out. So it had a really devastating effect on historic properties, especially as they plowed those freeway corridors into cities. Okay, so what happens as a result of that is people start agitating to Congress about the need for Congress to do something about this loss of historic properties. As a result of it, Congress passed the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And the Historic Preservation Act created the framework for historic preservation. So as we know it today, it's really a result of that act. Before the act, historic preservation was something that was done by individuals and small little grassroots groups. They were all disconnected from each other. There was no network. There weren't any standards for any work, or there were no professional standards. There were no standards for what people considered to be historic. It was just very laissez-faire. So the Historic Preservation Act created the structure on which we hung the modern preservation movement. One of the things that was created by the Historic Preservation Act was the National Register of Historic Places, and the idea behind that was really it was a very simple concept. The question was, how do we know that something's historic? How can we tell that there's a historic property? Because if the federal government is going to start looking at the way the federal government spends money and its effect on historic properties, we have to define what a historic property is first. So they created a national register to do that. It became the official federal list of building sites, structures, and objects significant in American history or prehistory. That's what the act says. And so the idea behind it was you're a bureaucrat that's spending federal money in some way. You're doing a street project or whatever. You can look at your project and then look on the list. And if something's on the list, then it's something you have to take into consideration when you're doing your project planning. If it isn't on the list, then you don't have to. That was the simple idea behind it and when it was originated. So it was simply supposed to be kind of a bureaucrat's best friend, a list of historic properties. But it became so much more than that because it was an official government recognition of the historic importance of properties, people attached a lot more importance to it than just that, and it became kind of the status symbol or the watermark for what makes a building significant. This is the very first building to be listed on the National Register in Sheboygan, the Young Carriage Factory, and it was listed on the National Register in 1974. 1974 was when the state appointed the first state historic preservation officer, my predecessor, and we started really kicking up a statewide program related to preservation. As of today, there are 23 individual buildings listed on the National Register in Sheboygan and one historic district. This is the historic district that's listed. It's the Downtown Churches Historic District, which is a concentration of historic churches. And you think, why is this church in there if it's a concentration of historic churches? This is a historic church too, because history doesn't stop, right? It keeps going. Remember that whole, we keep making more of it every day? So, that church was built in 1968, and the interesting thing about this little concentration of churches, you can kind of see how change in church architecture, in taste of church architecture changed over time there. The act also created a process where the federal government would look at the way that federal funding, licensing, and permitting occurred and the effect that it had on historic properties as a way to kind of police those big government programs. And it's called Section 106 because it's Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. And what Section 106 says is anytime you have a project that has federal funding, licensing, or permitting, the agency that's responsible for that has to look for historic properties, and they have to determine if they're there. And then if there's an effect they're having on those properties, they have to consider that effect, they have to assess it, and then they have to determine if there are adverse effects, if it hurts historic properties. They have to figure out can we avoid it? If we can't avoid it, can we minimize it? If we can't minimize it, can we mitigate it in some way? So there are properties that fall under this review every year, and it's a really broad sweeping law because it covers, the federal government is involved in many, many different actions. So my office reviews those projects, and we review about 3,000 of them every year, and it includes things like every cell phone tower built in the state of Wisconsin, every ATM, every highway project, including all the local road construction that's paid for with federal funding, soil conservation service loans, small administration, business administration loans, Army Corps of Engineer permits. The list goes on and on and on. And it's and what that does is it doesn't prevent these projects from happening. It just means that when they do happen, we think about the history as part of the planning process. You know, this is the construction project of Highway 12. They turned it from a 2-lane into a 4-lane. And when they were doing the work related to the highway, they found this ancient archaeological site right in the highway right-of-way. So these are archaeologists working on excavating that site at the very same time they're constructing the road. So the road moved forward, but we were able to recover that irreplaceable history there that otherwise would have been lost. So in Sheboygan, in the last 10 years, we've looked at 129 projects in the city. So, you know, that kind of stuff happens kind of quietly in the background, and you don't necessarily know that we're out there looking at historic properties in the city of Sheboygan, you know, at a very regular basis. So that's one of the ways we learn about historic properties is through this consultation process. The state has another parallel law to that called Wisconsin Statute 44.40, and it basically says if there's state funding, licensing, or permitting, the agency has to look for historic properties. We also proactive when we go out and look for historic buildings and archaeological sites through what we call architectural, historical, and archaeological surveys. And in the city of Sheboygan, we have recorded 47 archaeological sites. That's out of the 35,000 that we've found in the state to date. We've also documented 1,446 historic buildings and structures in the city. That's part of this database that we maintain of 140,000 historic buildings. And you can find this on our website. You just go to the website, click on Preserved Historic Properties, and you'll go right to this search box here. You can enter any address in the search box, and I'll tell you if we have a record of it and what we know about it. So we know about 1,446 historic properties in Sheboygan. So there's a lot of Sheboygan history on this site. And for each one of those, it'll return back this record here that gives you at least one picture of the building, what we know about it and its history. And that's kind of how we understand whether that's the basis that we use to determine if something's historically important or not. There are also 230,000 historic images of historic buildings on that site too.
I'm sorry, what website is it?
WisconsinHistory.org. It's easier to remember, right? WisconsinHistory.org. We have a program of certified local government grants. There are communities that are their historic preservation ordinances meet certain guidelines, and they apply for the status. And then every year we pass through $100,000 of the money that we get from the federal government to these communities to help fund work that lays the basis of historic preservation work. And this is a map kind of our reach in the state of Wisconsin. The little dots are properties that are on the National Register. The stars are tax credit projects. The dollar signs are communities that are certified local governments and have applied for grants from us. You can see Sheboygan over here, no little dollar sign by Sheboygan. So you're really missing out on a source of funding that can help fund that kind of basic work that helps to move historic preservation forward. And I'll talk a little bit more of that as we're moving along, but I think that's a huge missed opportunity right now for the city of Sheboygan. We have a program of historic homeowner tax credits. There is a state tax credit that gives you a credit back on work that you invest into a historic house that you are the owner occupant of. This is the only project in Sheboygan. That's the saddest thing I could possibly say. This is the only project in Sheboygan. And to give you a sense of what that can mean, the owner of this project saved $15,000 on their state income taxes by going through this program and getting their work reviewed by our office and making sure it met certain standards. And what that means is it's an incentive for people to do good quality work on their buildings that extends the historic life of them, and it attracts reinvestment into the city. One of the big problems that we have in older communities is that buildings slowly run down over time, right? You've seen it, you all seen it in your neighborhoods. Buildings slowly run down, people stop investing back into the neighborhoods, get worse and worse, and they have a gradual kind of spiral down the drain. This is a way to pull those buildings back out of the drain and make them viable again. This is where I start comparing to La Crosse. Compare that to La Crosse, which had 61 of these projects since 1990. Those 61 projects totaled $1.5 million of tax credits. So think, Sheboygan's the same size as La Crosse. You could have an incentive that would return $1.5 million in state taxes to people in Sheboygan, who then spend it on contractors to do work on their buildings. Stimulates the local economy, helps the tax base of the city. It's part of that reinvestment strategy that keeps communities vigorous. Well, why does La Crosse have so many more projects than Sheboygan does? It's because they have historic districts that they've listed on the National Register. There are 4 historic districts in the city of La Crosse that are residential, and in those are 375 buildings. So those 375 building owners qualify to apply for these tax credits, and 61 of them have applied and reinvested in their cities. Sheboygan has the potential for that and more. We did a survey of Sheboygan in 2004 and identified 8 historic districts that are residential in the community, and another 283 individual properties that are on their own merits alone are eligible for listing in the National Register and thus eligible for these tax credits. So this is the biggest missed opportunity for the city of Sheboygan right now. If I were to give advice to people in Sheboygan of what you should be working on that would help further historic preservation in Sheboygan, I'd say start here, list those historic districts, and start promoting that tax credit program. There are a number of properties in Sheboygan that applied for another program that we manage of federal historic preservation tax credits, and we've had 5 of those income-producing tax credit projects in Sheboygan, which totaled $38 million. That's not a small amount. That's $38 million of reinvestment in Sheboygan that has been spurred by the incentives of the income-producing tax credit program. They're mostly large-scale buildings. The Prange building is kind of an exception when you look at the buildings that have applied for it. This is one of the smaller ones. A lot of them are those big white elephant buildings in Sheboygan, the carriage factory, the shoe factory, those those really big buildings that nobody knew what to do with those, and many of them sat vacant for a long time until people realized that they could convert them into housing and put apartments in those places, and they started being rehabbed. So, one of the great things that Sheboygan has done in terms of historic preservation is saving some of these really big landmark buildings that in a lot of other places just get torn down, because for whatever reason, as soon as the building goes vacant, the first thing that comes out of people's mouths is, we better tear that building down, it's vacant. Right? You're having that debate right now in Sheboygan, aren't you? We won't have to mention that building. But these buildings have potential, and they can be assets to the community. So it can be a tool that helps turn around buildings. And what I don't see in Sheboygan that I see in La Crosse is it's not just these big white elephant buildings, it's other more modest buildings on the scale of this, that are also using tax credits. So Sheboygan had 5 projects of $38 million. La Crosse has had 26 projects for a total of $89 million. So almost 3 times as much investment in the historic buildings in La Crosse. And part of that, again, is because they list their historic properties on the National Register, and then La Crosse advocates for developers to come forward and do projects on their buildings. So they take an active role to try to encourage people to invest in them. So why do I care? Because this is our mission. Because historic places are critical to quality of life, we will expedite the preservation of places of enduring value. So that's why my office exists. That's the role that we play in all of this. We try to help people to preserve historic properties. So how do we do it? Well, we try to be proactive. We manage all of these programs that I've talked about, but we also do a number of other things. We mentor and train historic preservation consultants. So we work with people who identify historic properties, who do historical research. We help teach them skills and help build their knowledge base and their professional practice so that they can do better work, and all of us get to benefit from better work. We fund historic preservation activities through our Certified Local Government program. Since that program was put in place in 1982. So since 1982, we've been giving roughly $100,000 a year to communities in Wisconsin, and that has made a huge impact in some communities. The ones that have really partaken in that program and used that kind of funding to fund all of this kind of basic work that tells them where historic properties are and lists them and makes those advantages available and educates people about historic preservation, those communities have really benefited from them. And that's one of the reasons why La Crosse has so much more historic preservation than Sheboygan does, because La Crosse has taken advantage of that program and done a lot of kind of the legwork of historic preservation. That's why they have 4 residential historic districts as opposed to the goose egg here in Sheboygan. We also, we've looked for alternative sources of funding. We get some of our money we get from the federal government. We've been entrepreneurial, and we even have private donations that fund work that we do. So we keep trying to expand the available funding, because more funding means that we can do more and we can provide more services and more assistance to local communities. We train historic preservation developers. So we have an annual conference where we get people together who are interested in investing in historic properties, and we explain how these incentive programs work. We give them tools, and we talk about financing strategies or issues related to the standards of work, or all sorts of different things to try to have a more educated development community, and try to bring people who are developers who may not be doing historic projects into the fold and doing historic projects. We also share information about impact. we work with people who are preservation advocates and share information and give them tools that help them to encourage preservation in their local communities, kind of like the information I'm sharing here tonight. So I'm gonna end up here by talking a little bit about historic preservation tax credits in a little more detail, and kind of explaining how those programs work, because they're a major driver for a lot of reinvestment in historic properties. You probably all recognize these buildings, right? If you don't, drive west slightly. Okay, here are some just program statistics in general. The Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit's been around since 1982. It was created by Ronald Reagan. There used to be a grant program, and Ronald Reagan said, this is a great Republican idea. Ronald Reagan said, why are we giving away this free money to people? Wouldn't it be better if we took that same amount of money and we invested it in a program that encourages and leverages private investment? And so they changed it from a grant to a tax credit. And that tax credit started out being 25%. In 1986, it went down to 20%. So the state responded a few years later, and they made up that 5% difference. And by passing a 5% state credit. In 2014, that state credit was increased to 20%. And you can see the tremendous amount of investments that's happening in Wisconsin as a result of these credits. 3-year period, $171 million invested in, that's the credit. So times that by 4, and it tells you how much money is being invested in historic properties in Wisconsin in just that 3-year period. And it's making the difference for these projects happening. Right? And it's essential to historic preservation projects happening, because the real thing that keeps these projects from happening is there's a financing gap between what the bank is willing to loan on a project and what the project actually costs. And you have to find some other source of funding to fill that gap, and that's what tax credits do. So what's the cost of the state for this program? $171 million they allocated over that 3-year period. The really interesting thing about historic preservation tax credits, even that tax credit is not free money from the government. That tax credit's paid back to the state in all of the other taxes that project pays. They have to pay payroll taxes. They have to pay sales tax on all the building materials. They pay business tax, all of that. And economists have looked at this program and determined that what the state pays out in the tax credits, they recoup within 5 years of the project being finished. So the state gets all that money back, and they have encouraged reinvestment, which is like a smart investment for the state, in my opinion. By year 10, it's almost doubled the value in the economic development around those individual projects. This is a building in Darlington that was a project, Bob's Bitchin' Barbecue. And it's a great barbecue place. It's really super popular, and it has, Darlington's not a huge town, and this has been such an amazing economic engine for the city of Darlington that it's quite incredible. The downtown is just humming because of this one project, because it's drawing people down, and other businesses are starting up around it as a result of all of the activity that this very popular restaurant is generating. It also has an impact on local taxes too. Of all of the projects over that 3-year period, they have cumulatively increased the property taxes by 637%. So many of these buildings, because they're vacant or they're underutilized, they pay almost no property tax. Property tax are very, very low. So if you make a big investment in these projects, you're also making an investment in the tax base of the city, because these projects continue to pay property tax year after year after year after year. So every year, that counts to $19 million in additional tax revenue for local communities in Wisconsin. And it takes buildings that look like this building here. Many of you probably have seen this building. If you haven't, drive over to Plymouth. It's right in Plymouth. This is a building where before the big downturn in the economy in 2008, developers started doing work on it, started gutting the building. The deal fell apart and the building sat vacant. And the city had this half demolished building sitting right in the middle of the downtown. They listed the downtown on the National Register so a new developer could come in, get historic preservation tax credits. This building's fully rehabbed now, and it's brought back to the tax roll when it could have just been a parking lot otherwise. It creates jobs. Every time you rehab a building, you create jobs. So over that 3-year period, it created 15,680 construction jobs and operational jobs in Wisconsin because of that. There were $92 million in construction taxes paid. Remember, this program gave out $171 million in tax credits. It produced $92 million just in construction taxes. $35 million in operational taxes. So where does the money go from this program? The majority of it goes to small towns, towns of under 100,000 people. So it's towns the size of Sheboygan that benefit from this program. You can see Milwaukee has 25% of the population of the state, so it's not surprising they had 22% of the projects. But look at those numbers for cities the size of Sheboygan. So this is a program that works in communities of Sheboygan's size. That's what that says. Okay, this is the point where I stop talking, and all of you can ask whatever questions you want. I'm happy to talk about anything that you think you want to talk about. Yes?
You're not just dealing with Sheboygan City, you're dealing with the whole county of Sheboygan?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This program works in other parts of Sheboygan County, and I could have used examples from all the other Sheboygan County communities. Plymouth has had a couple of income-producing tax credit projects. The Kohler Corporation, that great factory complex in Kohler, that's a recipient of tax credits. So they've done a number of projects on buildings in the Kohler complex, and what that does is it gives Kohler an incentive to reinvest in those buildings in Kohler rather than look for somewhere else to move those jobs to. So it helps keep jobs in the county. Great point, though.
When establishing a residential historic district, are there restrictions on property owners?
That's a great question. The question is whether there are restrictions on property owners as a result of having a.
She lives in one.
Excellent.
And I remember going to a meeting,
Yeah.
and all the neighbors were there, and a group of myself included were very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
But there were some, no, we don't want the state to tell us what to do.
Yeah, that's right. Who wants the government? Raise your hand if you want the government to tell you what to do. Excellent. I like you. Yeah, right? Yeah, who wants that, right? So the great thing about the National Register of Historic Places is it doesn't regulate anyone other than the government. It regulates the federal government, the way to spend money. It does not regulate private property owners. So if you live in a historic district, you can either use that to your advantage and apply for that homeowner tax credit and be able to, get those save on your tax money and invest in your building, or you can choose not to, and it won't change your life in any way. And a lot of people have really strong misperceptions about what that district status means because people confuse local landmark designation, it happens under a local ordinance, with listing on the National Register. But National Register listing, it's only honorific and beneficial. That's it. That's all it helps you. So if you don't want to do something in your house, you don't have to. If you want to paint your house with pink polka dots on the outside, go ahead. You don't have to contact me. If you contact me, I'll say, hey, great, I can't wait to drive by it next time I'm in town and see it. I'm sure it's beautiful.
How about nonprofit buildings? I'm thinking of the Sheboygan Children's Museum.
Okay, what about nonprofit buildings? There is a way that nonprofit buildings can apply for historic preservation tax credits. It gets a little complicated, so I'm not going to go into the details of it. But the way it works is the nonprofit will partner with a for-profit. The for-profit comes in and takes ownership of the building, brings the money in to do the project, and then at the end of 5 years, they give the building back to the nonprofit after they've captured the historic preservation tax credits. So there are examples of, there are probably about, maybe 5 examples. The one in Plymouth is an example. There are probably 5, 6 projects like that in Wisconsin that have done that. The El Ringling Theater in Baraboo is probably the most notable one.
Is it pretty hard to get someone to partner?
No, I would say no. You just have to connect to people who know how it works. That's the important part of it, because it does get complicated, and they have to bring in attorneys to work out all of these ownership agreements and stuff like that. But it's certainly possible. Other questions? Yes.
Can private older homes get involved?
Can private older homes get involved? Yes, they can apply for the homeowner tax credit.
Let's say we don't really pay much tax anymore when we're at my age.
Yeah, well, you can spread that tax out up to 15 years. I've done 3 projects on my house. I live in a historic house, and I've done 3 projects on my own house. I put, in one project, my chimney was crumbling. The brick was made out of concrete, and it was just literally like crumbling. So I took the chimney all the way down to the roof line, and I rebuilt it, and I put a new roof on the building. That was my project number 1. My project number 2 is I fixed all the windows on the upper part of my building, going all the way around. I put new hinges on them. I replated all the original hardware. I replaced all the screens with stainless steel screens, so my screens don't rust anymore. And I made them more airtight. And then my 3rd project was to do all the windows on the bottom part of the building that I didn't get to in the first time around. So I did all those, and I also put a new furnace in and a new hot water heater. So I essentially got 25% off of my furnace and my hot water heater by going through that program, because I got that 25% tax credit. And because I don't have that much income, because I'm a lowly state bureaucrat, I spread that tax credit out over time and just used it until I could use it all up. And that took quite a long time, because I'm a lowly paid state bureaucrat and I don't have that much money.
So when you were remodeling, like the screens, didn't you have to replace them with the exact
Nope.
that was on?
Nope, I just had to get approval for what I did. Yeah, and I told them I wanted to replace the screen with stainless steel screen. They said, yeah, that's fine.
Well, then you are really preserving your modernizing.
Well, you are giving that building a useful life. It's not about, historic preservation is not about putting a building in amber and preserving it forever like it's a museum. It's about taking buildings and extending the useful life of them, but making changes in such a way that is sympathetic to the original character of the building. So you're not remodeling it, you're restoring it and giving it new systems. So, I have new electrical, I have a new furnace, I have a new hot water heater. So the systems in my house are all being upgraded and made new, but I'm preserving the things that make the house historic. So those qualities that make it a historic place are still there, and that's what the program's all about. It's not about trying to prevent change. I think the greatest myth about historic preservation is it's preservation is out to stop things from changing. There's nothing more wrong than that, because change is what preserves properties. If they don't change, they don't get to continue to live. Then they run down. So you have to reinvest in properties and you have to change them. That Sheboygan Theater is a great example of that. They saved, when they redid that building, they saved all the things that made that building historic. We walk inside and it is gorgeous and it looks historic, but all of the guts of that building are brand new. It's all modern technologies on the inside. And they had to make some changes to the building in order to make it functional today, but they did it in such a way that you can't really tell very much, right? That's the whole point of historic preservation. Reinvest in historic properties in a way that gives them a useful life. There was a question back here somewhere, I thought? No, maybe not? Yes.
Did you bring a picture of your house?
Did I bring a picture of my house? No, but let's see, do we have a Kleenex box here anywhere? It looks kind of like a Kleenex box. It's got flat roof, corner windows. It's a very early modern architecture design. It's 2 stories.
What year was it built?
It was built in 1936. So it was built during the Great Depression, when nobody was building anything. These architects started building houses for clients that were modern, because it was a lot cheaper to build a modern house. So it has a flat roof because you save all that framing, that would make a peaked roof. You get to save all that lumber and make a building more inexpensive that way. And it was kind of a cutting edge, architectural taste at the time. So I love it. I think it's a great house, but it's not for everyone. That flat roof.
It's my birthday,
1936,
1936.
okay. Uh-huh.
81 years.
Yeah, you were born in
House is 81 years old.
You were born in 36, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, you were too, see? Yeah, when I have my birthday party for my house, I'll invite the 2 of you. Really, I thought I should have a birthday party for it. It's been around for a long time, but it's never been able to celebrate, really.
Was that a Sears house?
No, it was not a Sears house, but, there are a lot of Sears houses in the state of Wisconsin. That's something that I kind of follow as a hobby. I look for Sears and Roebuck houses, and I try to identify them and document where they are. It's a really interesting phenomenon. Sears and Roebuck sold houses by mail order. You could just pick a house out that's in your catalog, and you could pick your house, and you go, oh, I'd like the 286P144, so you send in a check, and a couple months later, you go pick your house up at the railroad station, and it comes in a train car. And all the pieces are numbered and labeled, and you get it's like putting together a giant Lego set the size of a house. You look at the instruction, you go, okay, now this lumber that's stamped A58, those are all the floor addresses, so I have to take those, and now I put all those in, and then I look in the instructions to see what the next boards are. And if you drive a nail, you could build your own house. It was all pre-cut to size already. So it was a very interesting mass housing phenomenon. And Sears wasn't the only one that did them. There were a number of different companies that produced those kind of houses. There were 3 companies in Bay City, Michigan that did them. There was one in Iowa, Gordon and Tyne Company. And then there were a lot of other places that sold blueprints and stuff like that. So if you wonder where your house came from, if your house wasn't designed by an architect, it might have come from one of those kind of sources. And if you go into your house and you see that the beams, the joists, or the rafters are stamped with numbers, call me. Call me, because you probably have a mail order house. Anybody else?
Is there an alderman in the audience?
Is there an alderman? Yeah, great question. Is there an alderman in the audience? Former alderman. All right. Talk to your friends, right? Talk to your friends and tell them what Sheboygan's missing out on here, and that there are programs out there that would really benefit the city of Sheboygan. That's kind of what I love about my job is I get to sell good news all the time. It's really great. Anybody else? Yes, Travis?
The residential historic neighborhoods, where's the best place to start with organizing that to get the, you know, the distinction that it's a historic residential neighborhood?
Yeah, okay. Well, the first place to start is with the intensive survey that was done of Sheboygan that identifies all of the potentially eligible historic districts. I just looked at that document this morning, and it was produced in 2014. It's going to outline the neighborhoods so you know where the boundaries are. Then I would say step number 2 is find the people in that neighborhood who may be interested in helping and form a group of people together to get going on it. Then the next step would be to convince the city to apply for the funding to be able to write that nomination of that historic district. We give away that $100,000 every year. So the city just has to write a letter in August expressing interest in applying for the funds. We score all of those applications in November or early December. We award that money in February, and then you have 2 years to do the project. So that, you know, and if people are interested, they can just contact my office, and we'll walk you through what you need to do that. But I think, you know, that's the most important step that Sheboygan could be taking right now that it hasn't taken, because that's the basis on which a lot of this other stuff's built. People don't know their houses are historic unless you tell them they are. Right. Yes.
If a house is old, is it automatically historic?
If a house is old, is it automatically historic? No. No.
What is the criteria?
If a house is old, is it automatically worth saving? No, no. You know, I think that's another myth about historic preservation is people think that historic preservationists want to save everything that's old, and that's not true. That's not true. We're just trying to save the things that are really important, that mean something to communities.
Well, like, say for instance, our house is a 1908 house.
Yeah, yeah.
It's in good shape.
Sure.
Would that automatically make it worth saving, or does it have to have a particular thing about it?
Okay, if your house was built in 1908, is it automatically something that's historic? You know, in your eyes, sure, why not, right? But in the way the program works, historic property has to meet certain criteria. It either has to be significant as a work of architecture or engineering. It has to be associated with someone who made an important contribution to the local community. You know, like Michael Kohler's house here in Sheboygan. You know, who would argue that he was not an influential person in the city, the development of the city of Sheboygan? So his house would be one of those houses you can make an argument for. It's significant because of who he was and what he did and the impact that he had in the city of Sheboygan. It can be significant because of its relationship to the broad patterns of history. So the Sheboygan Theater not only is a great piece of architecture, but it also tells the story of arts and entertainment in this community. And it tells you the story of the rise of the Motion Picture Palace and how that related to people's entertainment in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and you know how that changed over time. You can see that in that building. It tells that story. Or properties can be significant because they're archaeological. So they can be significant because they're a Native American campsite, or they're a property that's or a burial mound or something like that that helps us to understand the history of people when they did not write their history down in history books like we do. Wisconsin's had people living here for 12,000 years, and only for about the last 150 have we been writing it down. You know, so those things help us understand that history.
Okay, so when you showed that one house, right, which I recognize that house in Sheboygan.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, that was always a residential house.
Yes.
What criteria made that a
That one was significant for architecture. It's a great example of the Italianate style. You know, that was popular from the 1870s through the 1880s, and it's a really nice example. It has all the features that houses have that we call Italianate today. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know how to ask it, but I see a sign down near, or signs, down near the lake that is it Coal District or Elderwood?
Ellis District.
Yeah, Ella.
Oh, okay. Jennifer, do you want to talk about that? I mean, I don't know really anything about the Coal Historic District.
Well, it's the Ellis District.
Okay.
So the city put together that terminology to kind of identify it as a neighborhood. People confuse it with being a historic district, but it's not.
Okay, so it's just it's a neighborhood area.
Neighborhood, it's probably has some of the oldest houses in Sheboygan
Okay,
in it,
yeah.
but there's no integrity left.
Okay,
They all have
okay.
vinyl and aluminum siding
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, so it's an older neighborhood, and they just use historic district as a way to identify the neighborhood, but it's not a historic district the way we're talking about it tonight.
Yeah, and we addressed that in the intensive
Yeah.
survey that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there any tax credits towards cemeteries?
Are there any tax credits for cemeteries? No. But cemeteries are protected under state law. That's part of what my office does, is we have the responsibility to protect human burials, whether they're in cemeteries or not, all across the state of Wisconsin. There have been people living here for 12,000 years, right? It also means there have been people dying here for 12,000 years, and they've been burying people in the state for 12,000 years as well. Some of those are buried in recent times, we bury those people in cemeteries. Before that, they buried them in a lot of other places. So we protect human burials in cemeteries. There's a process under state law where we can catalog a cemetery, which means we record that there is a cemetery here and here are the boundaries of the cemetery, and then it's protected from disturbance, and anyone who disturbs a human burial within that cataloged place can be prosecuted under state law. But that also applies to places that are not cemeteries. And part of what our office does is human remains are uncovered a lot in the state as people are doing ground disturbing activities. We like to say it's always a Friday afternoon that happens, because it seems like it anyway. Somebody sticks a backhoe in the ground and human bones come up. We get involved in that, and we make sure that the human remains are recovered and that they're treated appropriately and that they're reinterred somewhere. So they don't get to just throw them off in the discard pile and leave the remains there. We actually make sure that we identify who is in that burial. Is it prehistoric? Is it historic? Are they Native American? Are they European? And then we make sure that they are reinterred appropriately.
Is there a database for those cemeteries?
Yeah, there is actually a database, but it's not publicly accessible. We record them and we keep track of them, but we don't share it with the public because there are people who dig burials for copper arrowheads or artifacts, so we don't want to make it easy for people to loot and disturb graves. So we maintain that so we know where those properties are, but we don't share that publicly.
Do you protect churches, old churches?
Do we protect abandoned churches? Abandoned churches fall under all of these programs that I've talked about. We list churches on the National Register. There's actually a fairly high percentage of buildings listed on the National Register are churches, because if you think about it, at least in the 19th century, churches were oftentimes the most expensive, most ornate buildings ever built in the communities that they were in. So they're magnificent pieces of art, and they're part of the social life of communities too, so they tell the stories of communities and what people valued and believed at any particular place in time. One of my favorite churches in Wisconsin, not too far from here, it's up in Stengleville. Anybody been to Stengleville? Kewaunee County? It's a Czech church built by Czech congregation. All of the stained glass windows have Czech language inscriptions in them. It was designed by a Czech architect. It's beautiful. It's just really, really beautiful. So we list properties on the National Register like that so that it heightens people's awareness in them. They take more pride in the buildings. They're more likely to preserve them. They don't get to apply for tax credits because churches don't pay taxes. They're tax exempt.
And you have no authority if they decide to demolish it?
Yeah, the question is, do we have authority if they decide to demolish it? No, not any more than we do over anybody's house.
Oh,
You know, if they demolish it, I'm going to be really sad.
well, yeah.
That's I may even wag my finger in their general direction, but we have no authority over that, yeah.
Too bad, yeah.
Yeah. Great questions, great questions. Anybody, anything else? Jennifer, did I miss something really important I should have talked about? The armory.
Let's not avoid the elephant in the room.
Okay, the elephant in the room, the armory. You know, oftentimes I say that historic preservation is the art of the possible, that's really what it is. Not every building should or can be preserved, but I think when there are significant buildings in the community should take active steps to try to preserve them. And I think the Armory building is one of the most iconic buildings in the city of Sheboygan. I've been coming to Sheboygan for 30 years now in my work, and I can tell you that is an exceptional building. Even within the context of the whole state, it's an exceptional building. It tells a story about a really important chapter in American history when people were suffering during the Great Depression, and the federal government had to do something to try to employ laborers and put them back to work when 40% of the population was unemployed. And they came up with projects that they thought would improve communities, that would add to the social life and the value of communities, and then the federal government invested money in those properties. And the Armory is one of those. It's a spectacular piece of architecture. It's built like a tank. You know, that building could last another 300 years if people take the action to preserve it. You know, that building has great potential. And, you know, I'm encouraged by what's going on right now in that there's a chance to be able to reuse that building and bring it back into useful life. And I encourage people to get involved in that because I think that's a building that helps to define Sheboygan. Was that enough of an editorial?
If anybody wants to know more, come talk to me.
That's right.